Welcome to Lesson 1.4, Designing and Implementing Governance Documents. In your Candidate Information Bulletin, we are in the Security and Risk Management domain. We are in Key Area of Knowledge F, which is Develop and Implement Documented Security Policies, Standards, Procedures, and Guidelines. And our topics are going to include Information Security Policy Lifecycle, Attributes and Responsibilities, and the role of standards, baselines, guidelines, procedures, and programs. So let's start with an overview of our governance documents. Policies are high-level statements intended to communicate management's goals and objectives and to provide direction. And if you recall, we said that one of the responsibilities of the board of directors or executives, whoever the governing body is to review and to authorize policies. Standards, baselines, guidelines, and procedures support the implementation of a policy. So we have our policies being our high-level statements, so really telling us what the expectations are. Our standards, baselines, guidelines, and procedures, again, are going to support the implementation of the policy. So information security policies codify the high-level requirements for protecting information and information assets and ensuring confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Written information security policies may be a regulatory or a contractual compliance requirement. Sometimes you'll hear them referred to as a WISP, which is WISP, Written Information Security Policies. There are a number of regulations that actually require that there is a written information security policy document. Sometimes that document is very comprehensive and includes all the information security policies in one location. Other times there may be a library of information security policies. They may be discrete and separate. In either case, the fact that they are written and documented and that they need to be very, very high level. Each aspect of the information security program should have corresponding policy documents. Again, those documents are going to be our requirements. They're going to tell us what the expectations are. And that policies must be approved by executive management. That is a key oversight and authorization responsibility. So when you write a policy, and think of a policy as a teaching document, it's saying what the expectations are, what the requirements are. But in order for a policy to be effective, it has to have some key attributes. First and foremost, it has to be endorsed, meaning that it needs to have a number of people who have collaborated in the development, that in particular the departments that are going to be involved in the policy have contributed to it, so that they agree and understand and endorse it, if you will, and that it's gone up through layers of management with everyone saying, yes, this is a policy that makes sense for the organization, yes, we will support it, yes, we will put the appropriate resources behind it. It needs to be relevant to the organization. All too often, organizations go out to the internet, they find some sample policies, they download them, they just fill in the blanks, and they say, there you go, we've got policies. But they're not relevant to the organization, they don't match the organizational needs, and when that's pushed out to the entire user community and they look at that, they don't even understand what those policies are trying to accomplish. So it needs to be endorsed, it needs to be relevant. It also needs to be realistic. The policy needs to make sense in that it's both attainable, but it also reflects the constraints and reflects the structure of the organization. It does need to be attainable. We don't want to have a policy that is so far out of reach that no one can ever attain it, and then they're just going to circumvent it or just ignore it. It needs to be adaptable, meaning that it has to be a high level enough that if we need to change how we implement it, that we can make those changes. It does need to be enforceable, so it needs to be clear enough. The expectations need to be clear enough so that they can be enforced, and they do need to be enforced. They could have particular sanctions, and when they need to be enforced across the board. And they need to be inclusive, meaning that the policies should apply to everyone. Now, certainly there'll be policies that are specific to different activities. There might be a remote access policy. There may be a mobile access policy. You may have subsets. But in any case, within that subset or broadband, if the policy is broadly distributed, it needs to apply to everyone. That means that executive management, all the way through your temporary employee, should all be required to follow the same policies. Now, sometimes there may need to be exceptions, and if there are exceptions, those exceptions need to be approved by management and they need to be documented. There should be very few exceptions over time, but sometimes it is reasonable to put an exception in place. So let's review the life cycle of a policy. When we start with a policy, we start in the development phase. And in the development phase, first we're planning. We're saying, what do we need this policy for? And remember, we want a policy that matches every aspect of our information security program. So we have our plan. What does this policy need to accomplish? We need to do research, and the research are what are best practices that might relate to the policy, what are regulatory requirements that would relate to the policy, what are legal requirements that relate to the policy. We then need to write the policy. That policy should be vetted, so it should go to compliance, it should go to legal, it should go perhaps to the department that's going to be most impacted, so that everybody has input, and that will really help with buy-in, but it's been a collaborative process. It then should be approved by management, and then it should be authorized by the executives, so that could be executive management or the board of directors, whatever the oversight body is. So that's our first phase, as we develop it. Then we take that same policy and we have to publish it. And the things we have to think about in the publication phase are going to be, how are we going to communicate, how are we going to disseminate, and how are we going to educate? So how do we let folks know that this policy even exists? And then how do we make it accessible and available to them, perhaps on your intranet? And then we also need to educate. We need for personnel to not only know that the policy exists, but they need to understand how the policy affects them and what's expected of them. So we've developed and now we've published. Now we're in the adoption phase. So everybody knows that the policy is out there and what they're supposed to do. And then in adoption, we're actually going through the process of implementing the policy. We're monitoring the policy to ensure that, one, the policy makes sense and it works, but we're also monitoring for compliance with the policy. And when we find that there's an area or a person that's not in compliance, we need to make enforcement decisions. Now, sometimes within a policy, you'll see sanctions, and you'll see for a first infraction, this is what happens in second and third. Enforcement is really an area that information security personnel need to work very, very closely with HR personnel to understand what is the best way to do enforcement and sanctions. And then, because almost everything we do in information security is really an iterative process, we need to review that policy. It's recommended, and many regulations require, that policies are reviewed on an annual basis. We're soliciting feedback. Is this policy working? Is this policy still viable? Does this policy still meeting the objectives? So we want to solicit feedback on that. Really almost back to the development phase, a lot of the same functions that we're doing there. And then the choices will be to either reauthorize the policy or to retire the policy. And in either case, whether we're reauthorizing or retiring, that almost brings us right back to the publication phase, where we're going to communicate, we're going to disseminate, we're going to educate what's happening with that policy. So there are some very definite responsibilities throughout this life cycle. And we're looking at sort of board of directors or executive management, that's one group, and operational management. In operational management, in this case, I would include the organizational roles that we've discussed, as well as the information security management roles. So during the development phase, it's really up to operational management to plan, to research, to write, to vet, and to approve. The board of directors should be always communicating their guiding principles as well as the mission of the organization, and they will be the ones to review and authorize the policy. As we move into the publication phase, it's operational management's responsibility to communicate, disseminate, and educate, and it is up to the board of directors and executive management to champion the policy, so to provide visible leadership and support. As we move into the adoption phase, operational management will be responsible for implementing, evaluating, monitoring, and enforcing, and the board of directors should be leading by example. And lastly, in the review phase, it will be operational management who is providing feedback and making recommendations. It will be the board of directors or executive management who reauthorize or approve retirement. So very, very definite responsibilities throughout the entire policy lifecycle. We're going to be looking at policies throughout this course. In various lessons, what I'm going to do is show you a policy that's applicable to that lesson so that you can see the construct of that and where research may have come into play, where vetting comes into play, and how executive management can both champion the policy and lead by example. So policies themselves, though, are not going to accomplish what we're looking to do because they're just very high-level governance documents. So supporting policies, we have a set of other documents. We have standards, we have guidelines, and we have baselines. So you can see to the left of the policy, we have guiding principles that influence the policy. Then we have our policies, then standards, guidelines, procedures, and baselines. So we're going to talk about each one of those. So starting with standards. The most important thing you need to know about standards is that they are mandatory. Standards serve as specification for the implementation of policy, and they dictate mandatory requirements. There's no latitude in standards. Now again, just like in a policy, you might have to have an exception to a standard, and then that exception needs to be approved and it needs to be documented. But you don't have any latitude. It's not like, oh, I might want to apply this or not. They're mandatory unless you have an exception process. So let's look at an example. Perhaps we have a policy that says all users must have unique user IDs and passwords that conform to the company password standard. Now you'll notice that the standard itself is not part of the policy. It's just being referenced in the policy. The standard may be that passwords are required to be a minimum of 8 characters, upper and lowercase alphanumeric, must include at least 1 special character, and must not include the user's name, company name, or location. Those are specific and mandatory implementation requirements. So where the policy says you have to have a user ID and password and the password must conform to the standards are telling us exactly what we need to do. Standards are very, very rarely approved or authorized by executive management. Standards are generally implemented by whatever group has been assigned responsibility for implementation of that policy. And that's important because standards really do need to be flexible. They may change over time. It may turn out that 8 characters really isn't long enough, that there should be 12 characters. It may be that we decide that for regular users we want them to have 8 characters, but administrative users we want them to have 12 characters or 16 characters. So in designing the standards we need some latitude opposed to how a policy is authorized by executive management. But once a standard is put in place, it is a mandatory requirement. So you may wonder, well, where do I find what my standard should be? There is a lot of best practice guidance out there. They are created by government agencies. You'll see them by nonprofit organizations. There are industry standards. There's best practice guidance. And it's usually driven by a regulatory professional or a business demand or familiarity with technology. So some sources are the International Organization for Standardization, referred to as ISO. The ISO has a 27,000 series. It's a whole series of standards and guidance and best practices in relation to information security. The ISO 27000 series, however, you do have to license, you have to purchase that, and later on we'll be taking a tour out to their website. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, has an entire series that's devoted to information technology and information security standards and guidance. It's called their 800 series. You'll see it abbreviated as the SP 800. We're going to be looking at a number of those documents throughout this course, and I will be pointing out to you which ones that you should be downloading and studying, both for your examination, but really just for your own knowledge. It should always be sort of handy on your digital bookshelf. SANS has a number of policies and best practice guidance that are out there, standards policies and best practice guidance, and then the various publishers and manufacturers such as Microsoft and Cisco and Apple all publish standards and best practice guidance for their respective technologies. As we move from standards to baseline, a baseline is just an aggregate of standards, so a collection of standards, if you will, for a specific category or a grouping, for a platform, a device type, for ownership or location. We might say for our Windows servers, here are all of the standards that apply to those Windows servers. And we put them together, that's referred to as a baseline. Very often you'll hear that referred to as a minimum baseline, so that's sort of our starting point. You must have these. Now you may choose to do other security controls as well, but this is the required minimum. You must have this baseline. The objective of a guideline is to help people understand and conform to a standard. So a guideline is going to be a little softer language, a little bit more gentle. It will be really designed for the audience that is trying to do the implementation in a way that they understand, but it is not a mandatory requirement that you do it this way. Think of it as just very much as guidance, how you're going to implement a particular standard. Guidelines really are customized to your intended audience, again, not mandatory. Let's think about an example. In a guideline, we might want to be helping people construct their passwords. So we said that they had to have an 8-character password, complex, uppercase, lowercase, special character. That's what we said in our preceding slide here about our standard. So maybe it's really hard for people to come up with a password that matches that. So maybe we say, think of a passphrase. Think of a name of a favorite song or just a phrase that you like, and use the first letter in each word of those phrases. And then we may also give them guidance that said, turn your E's into 3's and turn your I's into 1's, or turn your I's into exclamation point. But just ways to help them implement a standard that may otherwise be difficult. Then we move to procedures. And a procedure are just instructions for how either a policy, a standard, a baseline, or a guideline is to be carried out in a given situation. Procedures focus on very discrete actions or steps with a specific starting point and a specific ending point. So think of procedures as just really a set of instructions. And there are 4 commonly used formats for procedures. We have a simple step, and a simple step is do this, do this, do this, do this, do this. There's no latitude, it's just follow right along. A hierarchical procedure generally has a column A and a column B, or a title and a subtitle, and it starts with telling us what we're trying to accomplish and then outlines the various steps. And that's really useful when you've got audiences of varying skill levels. So someone who is very familiar with what you're asking them to do doesn't need the detailed step. They can look at the heading or the column on the left-hand side, however it's designed. Someone who is much less familiar can follow the very specific steps. A graphic is just what it sounds like. It's pictures. Sometimes easier for an audience to look at pictures, particularly if there's danger or we need them to stop something quickly, or the instructions would not be in their native language. So we can do it with a graphic. And a flowchart is used when there's decision making. So if we have a number of decision making steps, you'll often see a procedure in a flowchart will be this, do this, if not, go here. And lastly, we have plans that are also called programs, and those terms are used really interchangeably. So the function of a plan, also known as a program, is to provide strategic and tactical instructions and guidance on how to execute a specific initiative or how to respond to a situation. Now, some of the key elements of a plan or a program is that generally within a certain time frame, there's usually defined stages, and there's usually designated resources. So various plans or programs that you may encounter would be an incident response plan, a disaster recovery plan, a business continuity plan, a vendor management plan, or all of those also might be called programs, but they're both sort of strategic. They'll give you an overview of how we're trying to either execute the initiative or respond to the situation. It will tell you sort of what our time frame is. It will give you information about steps. We may see these various stages, who should be involved in it, what are roles and responsibilities, who are the resources that are available. There's very often going to be a policy, almost always actually, there'll be a policy that relates to the program. The policy will be very high level, and then the plan or the program will be much more detailed. So let's do a lesson review. We started out with the idea that we need governance documents. Governance documents, which start with policies, are designed to communicate executive management strategies and then provide instructions on how to implement those strategies. We looked at the policies, we looked at policy lifecycle, the policy attributes, and the related responsibilities. We looked at the roles of standards. Remember, standards are mandatory. We looked at baselines, which are a collection of standards, so they're also mandatory. Guidelines, which is just guidance to help us to implement a mandatory standard. Procedures, which were our instructions, and programs. So that brings us to lesson 1.4, match the meaning. I want you to be able to define policy, standard, baseline, guideline, procedure, and plan or program. As always, on the right-hand side, we've got them all mixed up. So put me on pause, take a moment and match them up, then come on back and we'll go through them. All right, let's take a look at lesson 1.4 terms. The first is our policy. Again, our policy is a high-level statement. Our policies are going to be reviewed and authorized by our governing body. They set the stage. A standard is a mandatory specification. It is how we're going to implement the policy. A baseline is an aggregate or a collection of standards for a specific group. That group might be a set of devices, it might be locations, it might be users, but it's an aggregate of standards that relate to some group. A guideline is just conformance guidance. It really just helps us understand what we need to do to conform or to follow a mandatory requirement. Procedures are step-by-step instructions. We discussed 4 types of procedures. We discussed a simple step, a hierarchical, a graphic, and flowchart. And lastly, we have plans or programs. I want you to think of plans or programs as a roadmap for a specific initiative or response to a situation. Generally, it has designated stages, it has designated resources, it has specific instructions. But it's a roadmap for how you're going to do a particular initiative or how you are going to respond to a particular situation. Hope you did well. So let's wrap up with looking at our CISSP exam tips. Things we want to remember, in addition to everything else, is that policies require executive authorization, that policies, standards, and baselines are mandatory. Policies, standards, and baselines are mandatory. Guidelines are optional. Now, if you can't meet a policy, standard, or baseline, there can be exceptions. But there should be a policy for exceptions, and it will be a very defined process for how you document the exception and how you get approval for that exception. And lastly, the procedure should always be targeted to your audience. Your users or your contractors or third parties, whoever the audience is going to be using those procedures. You need to make sure that when you write them, in whatever form you use, that you understand who the intended audience is. Thank you for joining me for this lesson, and I look forward to seeing you in the next.